Welcome to The Landscape, your show about America's parks and public lands. I'm Aaron Weiss with the Center for Western Priorities in Denver.
And I'm Kate Groetzinger in Salt Lake City. Today on the podcast, we're talking to New Mexico Shooting Sports Association President Zachary Fort about why he's opposing Steve Pearce's nomination to run the Bureau of Land Management. While we may not see eye to eye with Zach on everything, we certainly agree that Steve Pearce is a threat to our public lands. Before we get to that conversation, though, let's do the news.
Leading the news this week is an effort by Minnesota Congressman Pete Stauber to strip protection for the boundary waters. Stauber is trying to undo a Biden-era mining ban over 225,000 acres of public land that is just upstream of the legendary Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. A resolution to overturn that mining ban passed the House on Wednesday and is heading to the Senate right now. Stauber's ultimate goal is to build the Twin Metals mine, which is, of course, being developed by a Chilean mining conglomerate. This move not only threatens one of America's most iconic wild places, it also has broader ramifications for the future of public land management. Stauber is trying to use the Congressional Review Act on that mining ban, which was put in place, of course, by President Biden. The CRA, Congressional Review Act, allows Congress to overturn rules within a certain time frame of when they're finalized. It's already been used or abused by members of Congress in the past year to repeal Biden-era resource management plans in Montana and Wyoming. All of this is a little bit complicated, but the short story of what's happening here is that members of Congress are using the CRA in a way it never was intended to be used, to reverse actions that had not previously been treated as rules at all, including this mining ban. So if Pete Stauber's effort succeeds here, it opens up mineral withdrawals potentially, along with other protections for public lands across the country, to being overturned because the Interior Department had never submitted those to Congress as rules. The result here is it could put Congress in the business of micromanaging decisions that had been shaped by local input and the experts on the ground who know what is necessary to manage our public lands. And here's one more thing about the CRA. It is very much a blunt instrument. It precludes administrations from putting any similar rule into place. So if Stauber succeeds, it could make it impossible for a future administration to then protect the boundary waters using another mineral withdrawal. We're going to keep a close eye on this one. As I mentioned, it is over to the Senate now to debate whether to reverse this mining ban. And of course, there will be lots of court challenges to follow.
Karen Bud Phelan is also back in the news this week. The House Natural Resources Committee is calling for an investigation into that $3.5 million water rights deal we mentioned in our last episode. If you missed it, basically, Bud Phelan's husband signed a deal with the mining company behind the Thacker Pass mine in Nevada to sell water rights owned by their family ranch. At the time the deal was signed, Bud Phelan was a top official at the Interior Department under the first Trump administration. And here's the kicker. That $3.5 million deal depended on the mine receiving a permit to move forward from the Interior Department, where Karen Bud Phelan worked. And it did receive that permit in the final days of Trump's first term. Yet, Bud Phelan didn't disclose any of that in her ethics filings, which ethics experts argue she really should have. In their letter, the House Natural Resources Committee details how Bud Phelan may have exerted control over that decision to permit the Thacker Pass mine, or at least allow it to move forward. And they call on the Inspector General to look into whether she abused her position or not. All of this is extremely relevant because Bud Phelan is currently the number 3 person in charge at the Interior Department, even though you may have never heard of her. That's kind of the point. And she still owns a ton of ranch land in addition to stock in oil and gas companies, which raises questions about how she may be continuing to abuse her position.
Now, before we hop into this interview with Zach Fort, I want to flag that BLM director nominee Steve Pearce also has significant conflicts of interest, many of them very much in alignment with what we're talking about with Karen Bud Phelan. His ethics filing revealed that he made over $1 million last year renting out frack tanks to oil and gas companies, at least some of which were operating on public lands. He's also selling water rights. We don't know to whom, but that's a similar situation to Karen Bud Phelan. So Steve Pearce has promised to hand over ownership of that oilfield services company to his wife if he's confirmed BLM director. I'm sorry, that doesn't really make me feel a whole lot better. There are a lot more questions to be asked about Steve Pearce's ethical conflicts.
Right, handing over those that business to his wife, just like Karen Bud Phelan handed over that family ranch control to her husband.
This whole notion of I'm going to maintain a financial stake, but I just won't be involved in the day-to-day management. I just keep coming back to they made Jimmy Carter sell his peanut farm when he became president, and how far we have fallen from those sorts of days.
Our guest today is Zach Fort, president of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. He's an independent who lives in Albuquerque and is opposing Steve Pearce's nomination to lead the Bureau of Land Management. Zach, thanks for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on your podcast. Appreciate it.
Of course. Well, let's start with the basics. Tell us about yourself and what led you to oppose Steve Pearce's nomination, who I should mention is a former congressman from New Mexico, hence your connection.
Yes. So thanks again for having me on the podcast. I think my opposition to Steve Pearce may come as a surprise to some people, but I think we're going to have a good conversation today and explain why myself, somebody who is typically would be seen allied with people like Steve Pearce in the past, is opposing him today. So quick brief for you. Thank you for introducing me. I am the president of New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. New Mexico Shooting Sports Association, or I typically just call it NMSSA. We've been around in New Mexico since 1935. We are predominantly a firearm rights organization. We focus very heavily on making sure people have the ability to exercise their Second Amendment rights as we understand them. This is we are very heavily focused on New Mexico. I mean, we are a New Mexico organization. I live in Albuquerque. My board members live across the state of New Mexico. So we're very heavily focused on that. But I think where there's this nexus that's been growing, and I think there's been a lot more, and NMSSA is not alone in paying attention to this. Other gun rights groups are focusing on this, is the connection to kind of public land and what it means for hunters and gun owners. Because it's not just hunters, it's people who also do sport shooting as well, but very heavily hunters, and understanding what this heritage that we have with this land, the connection we have, and preserving these places for future generations. So NMSSA is very heavily focused on that, but there's this real growing nexus between the two that I'm excited to talk to you guys about today.
So as a shooting sports advocate, as a sportsman, what is the objection to Steve Pearce?
So it's a great question. I think, I'm going to get a little high level here, then kind of get back down to the details. So whenever we talk about anything that deals with firearm laws, there's typically, there's three areas of firearm ownership. There's the what, the who, and the where. The what, which typically receives most attention when we talk about anything gun related, is the what type of firearms are people allowed to own. But equally important is the who and the where. The who being the who can own a firearm, who can possess a firearm, and then the where, which is where we're talking today, is where can you carry and use a firearm? And this is where the connection to public lands comes in. For people in the West, New Mexico, we're a Western state out here. We're one of the biggest states in the country by land size. We're a largely rural state. We're blessed with abundance of public land. We have a lot of actually state land that we can use. We also have federal land, both national forests and BLM land. So whenever we talk about this stuff, we want to ensure that people have adequate opportunities, because there's a lot of people in New Mexico who use state land, who use federal land. Myself personally, I go shooting on state land, on federal land, because there's places where people can safely and responsibly go do this on state and federal land. So the question of, what's going on with, why would we oppose Steve Pearce, somebody who was a Republican congressman, pretty far to the right when he was in Congress, why would we be opposing his nomination to lead the Bureau of Land Management? And that's because, in New Mexico, we saw his track record of being very anti-public land, for the lack of a better term, throughout his term in Congress. I mean, he's made statements in the past, and while he was a congressman, that was kind of opposed to the idea of public land altogether. And what would people need to understand? What could happen is places where New Mexicans hunt and shoot on public land, because we have a lot of it in this state, if that land were to be transferred over to private holders, whether that's an oil and gas company, whether that's a rancher or just an investor, there will likely be some kind of fence that will go up around that land. And these places where people have hunted and gone shooting for generations would no longer be accessible to them. And that would likely be forever. Um, so that's kind of our objection there, is given his strong track record of anti-public land statements and the reliance that New Mexicans, and also this is not just a New Mexico thing. New Mexico would be heavily impacted. We have a lot of federal land. We have a lot of BLM land here, but this would be all across the West, and which is why I strongly believe that Western gun rights organizations need to be paying attention to this, because this impacts the where people can go shoot, where people can go hunt, where people can exercise their rights.
And I understand that your organization also opposed Mike Lee's effort to sell off public land earlier this year. Was that sort of your first foray into this realm of public land advocacy almost?
It has been, yeah, because it's a new evolving issue. I think other gun rights groups are paying more attention to this, because you saw a lot of opposition to Mike Lee's bill. We were one of the kind of the more explicit gun rights groups that spoke out against it. But I think there are other groups as well that were paying attention to this and saying, if these places where we hunt and we shoot, in many cases for generations, is sold off, then we're not going to have that access anymore. And the justification they're giving is for this kind of, well, it's for housing. It's like a lot of the places we do this kind of stuff that they're talking about selling is be a really terrible place to build a house. It wouldn't be remotely affordable. So they're talking about this very lopsided, well, we do absolutely need more affordable housing in this country. There's certainly in New Mexico, we need more affordable housing, but taking something that's, kind of way out there in Rio Arriba County and selling that off, that you're not going to build affordable housing out in the middle of nowhere. You're going to we want to use these places to shoot and to hunt. It's going to be somebody who's going to buy this as an investor, as some kind of business transaction, who's going to be buying that, not somebody who's going to be building, affordable housing, 2 hours away from any metro area. So that's kind of where we got involved, is like, this is silly. People want to do this. And we saw a lot of support from the hunter community, from gun rights people, when we spoke out against that. And I think that was our first foray in being publicly against something like that, speaking out for public land. And by and large, we saw a lot of support from people who we align with, from hunters, from people who, from sport shooters, on protecting public lands and making sure that these places where we go to hunt and shoot are protected and people can continue these traditions.
What has Pearce done or said in the past that leads you to this point of being so sure that he is not a good fit at BLM?
He sponsored legislation in the past when he was a congressman that would direct the Forest Service, which is over, the Department of Agriculture, which is over the Forest Service, to sell off their Forest Service lands, and Department of Interior, which is over Bureau of Land Management, to sell off Department of Interior lands. He sponsored legislation, at least one bill that explicitly said you need to reduce land holdings, which is similar to the bill from Mike Lee, which directed them to reduce land holdings. I think we saw a much greater swell against Senator Lee's bill, because he was when you have kind of the Republican trifecta in Washington, D.C., that was a much greater threat, it was viewed at the time. When Pearce sponsored his legislation, they didn't have that trifecta, so it was less of a threat. I think that it was perceived by people. So there wasn't quite as much of an uproar when Pearce did it, but when Lee did it with that Republican trifecta, Lee being in that being a part of that Republican trifecta, so to speak, you saw a much greater groundswell of grassroots opposition to the idea of selling off that public land and reducing opportunities for hunters and shooters.
That's a great point. I hadn't really thought about the difference in response to those two proposals and how context really shapes that. So after Pearce left Congress, he became the chair of the New Mexican Republican Party. My understanding is you were somewhat involved in the party, or at least observing its inner workings. Can you tell us what happened to the party under his leadership and sort of why that concerns you?
Yes. So, just a little personal background on me. I'm a former Republican. I was a Republican when Steve Pearce became state party chair. It was during his tenure as the state party chair that I actually personally chose to leave the Republican Party of New Mexico. And there's a lot of reasons that go into that. But really, when before Pearce came to power in the state Republican Party, the Republican Party was a much more better representative, did a much better job representing New Mexico. There was a quote unquote purple state, if we're going to use kind of those color assignments to describe political party affiliation, where they had Susana Martinez, who was Republican governor of New Mexico. When he was first elected, R.J. Berry was mayor of Albuquerque, and Republicans had it was a slim majority, but they actually had a majority in the state House of Representatives. But after the leadership, when everything, it was rather than trying to focus on representing New Mexicans, you had a state party that was interested in running constant purity tests to determine who was the most pro oil and gas candidate they could possibly find. And that's where some of this tension becomes, because oil and gas companies, they have a lot of pieces of land they would love to go drill for oil and gas in. And they're not going to allow people to go hunting and shooting on these land once they take ownership of that land. And we already have a hard enough time on state land, where state land gets leased, where there's leases for oil and gas, where there's leases for ranching on state land. And what do? They immediately do everything in their power to stop all hunting and shooting activities, even doing things that are illegal to stop hunting going on from that land, even though they have no right to do so because it's a lease on state land. It's land they don't own. But when you had these purity tests of doing everything they can to push out anybody who may be moderate, who may not necessarily want to just hand over everything to oil and gas, hand over fist, that's when you had a lot of division in the party. They largely abandoned the Albuquerque metro area. Today, Albuquerque, Mayor Keller was just elected to a third consecutive term. No one's ever done that before. He easily defeated every Republican challenger that's been offered up, even though 10 years ago, Albuquerque had a Republican mayor. So there's just this massive, massive shift as the Republican Party largely turned their backs on New Mexicans, what the Mexicans want. And it really just kind of became this party that became very centered in either the northwest quadrant of the state, where you have a lot of coal and natural gas, and the southeast quadrant of the state, where it's part of the Permian Basin oil field, which, as your listeners are probably well aware, is the preeminent oil development area in this country right now. It does stretch into New Mexico. And that's not to say there's been a ton of oil development in that part of the state. Nothing that the Democrats have done. They've put regulations there, but they haven't stopped it the way the Republicans claim that they would have. I mean, the oil and gas companies can speak for themselves. They don't need people like me to advocate for them. They have the pockets to do that themselves. It's my job to advocate for the hunters and people who want to use the land for something other than oil and gas. But the Republican Party apparently has no interest in representing people who are not just wanting to hand over everything to oil and gas companies.
I see. So it sounds like what you're saying is there's sort of two issues here. There's his prioritizing oil and gas over all else, which of course we know he has a background in oil and gas. He owns an oil field services company, and up until recently owned shares and leases in the Permian. And then there's a second issue of his just sort of mismanaging the party and pushing out moderates and not sort of creating a big tent, which has led the party to become ineffective. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. It's kind of long-winded my answer, but that's a great summary of kind of the issues of, prioritizing oil and gas above all else, really kind of turning the back. Because New Mexicans, we love our public land. We really do. We have some I know there's beautiful places all over the West, but we really have some phenomenal places in New Mexico. It's bipartisan. People love our public land. We love our outdoors. We love our mountains, our desert landscapes. We don't just want to be an we appreciate the money that oil and gas provides to our state, but we're not just an oil and gas state. We're a lot more than that. And when you have a political party that is apparently dedicated to a single issue, it becomes a problem particularly for other people who want to use land for other means. Then yes, and then what that translated to in the state party was pushing out anybody who wasn't just super pro Steve Pearce. I mean, a lot of the gains Republicans made in New Mexico with other communities has largely been eradicated. And Democrats really have a supermajority in the state legislature today, whereas, it used to be relatively close, even to the point where Republicans about 10 years ago actually had a slim majority in the House of Representatives.
That reminds me of one thing that we spoke about earlier this month or last year, the last time we spoke, which is that hunters are sort of left without a political home in the case that they need and want public lands to be protected and kept, in public hands. But they maybe don't align politically with Democrats. Can you say a little bit more on that and specifically how that breaks down in New Mexico? Because it sounds like that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so anytime, I talk to people from all political parties. Anytime I talk to anybody from the Republican Party, the question I will inevitably ask every single time is, how do we get hunters to vote Republican? Because there's a lot of hunters who vote for Democrats, a lot of hunters who vote Libertarian. There are certainly hunters who vote Republican as well, but they're kind of confounded by the idea that hunters aren't just solidly in the camp of Republicans. Hunters are most hunters are gun owners, even if they do bow hunting. Most people I know who predominantly bow hunt still own firearms of some capacity. I'm sure there's some who don't own any firearms, but for the most part, hunters are gun owners. And oftentimes, people wonder, like, well, why are these hunters who are gun owners, why are they voting for Democrats, even though this is such a big issue for them? And what I have to do is explain to them is, yes, a lot of them, there are Democrats who don't like the firearms that some of these people own, particularly semi-automatic rifles, which some people do choose to hunt with. So they don't always like their guns, but Democrats want to take away their guns. You want to take away their land, and you need both to go hunting. And for some people, choosing the land is the more important political issue to them, is ensuring they have access to land. And this becomes really, really important in northern New Mexico, where a lot of our best hunting grounds in this state and most beautiful places are in northern New Mexico, where you have this patchwork of state, federal, tribal, private land. So you've got all this stuff going on when land access is a huge issue. Because like I said, too many times hunters get put down to the bottom when it comes to land access. You've got your oil and gas comes number one, ranchers number two, and then hunters are somewhere down at the bottom. Whereas hunters, we want to have a seat at the table. We want to have the same opportunity as other people to safely and responsibly use this land. So that's kind of what happens with hunters. They get attacked from one side. They really get attacked from both sides because there's people who may not necessarily like elements of what they're doing, so they end up being politically homeless. So yes, some hunters vote Republican. A lot of hunters in New Mexico also vote Democrat. And a lot of that is because of land access and use.
I want to peel back that onion a little bit, because one of the things we hear from folks like Mike Lee and Steve Pearce is, well, just hand the federal land, the national public land, over to the states. It'll be state land. You'll still be able to access it, but the state will manage it somehow magically better. From your perspective as a hunter, as a shooting sports advocate, does that argument hold water?
So I think they like to make the argument theoretically, because, in New Mexico, we have a lot of state-owned land as well. I can't speak for every state in the West, but in New Mexico, we do actually have a lot of state-owned land. So they like to talk about the potential of handing it over to the state of New Mexico. And in theory, that could work in terms of ensuring access. The problem is, what kind of the nuance is what land are we talking about? And is the state of New Mexico going to want to purchase this land? Is the state of New Mexico going to be in a position to purchase this land? Because I have yet to see anybody at the state legislature talk about allocating money to purchase federal land, or really talk about what that would actually look like. So it kind of just becomes this straw man of, oh, well, we could sell it to the state, but if the state doesn't have the money to buy it immediately when we go to liquidate these huge holdings, then we're just going to be forced to sell it to private investors. So it's kind of this like straw man that's kind of stuck out there, like, yeah, that could work. That could happen. We do have opportunities to go hunt and shoot on state land, but is that actually going to happen? Or is this just hey, we could do this, but if the state doesn't come up with the money, then we're just going to be forced to sell it to private investors.
And then how do you pay to manage it once you do own it?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that have to go into the management of land. And the state of New Mexico does have some very qualified, good land managers that we're appreciative, that do oversee state land resources for us. So I'm not trying to diminish their ability to do stuff, but people are willing to pay a lot of money for this land, and is the state of New Mexico going to be the highest bidder in all these areas when you could have some large private investors, oil and gas companies? These large oil and gas companies, in terms of their total annual revenues, dwarf the state budget of New Mexico easily. I mean, the state of New Mexico could be far behind a lot of other people when it comes to bringing money to the table. So it's just this theoretical straw man of that could happen. And yes, that could work, but it's practically, I don't necessarily see that being a real option.
Zach, one more question for you. And sorry, this is a bit of a curveball. And you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. But Martin Heinrich, senator from New Mexico, who purports to be a big champion of public lands and honestly has been in the past. We're very appreciative of his efforts on public lands.
And also a big hunter.
And a big hunter.
Yep.
He hasn't said anything publicly about Pearce that I've seen, unless I'm missing anything, right, Aaron?
No, it was a pretty much we'll examine him the same way we examine every nominee at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, Zach, what's your insight into that? Why hasn't Heinrich come out against Pearce in your view, if you have any
So I have
insight?
not had any personally. I've not had any communication with Heinrich's office regarding the Steve Pearce's nomination. I can tell you that Heinrich has built a lot of his reputation and career in New Mexico as the public lands advocate, as the Democrat hunter, and he kind of fits a lot of the kind of that demographic of people who typically vote Democrat but are hunters. I mean, he talks about hunting. He posts pictures of him out there hunting. I totally respect him in his hunting stuff. I mean, there's other areas of policy I strongly disagree with him, but on hunting, it's like, oh yeah, it's good to have people from New Mexico who are talking about hunting representing us in the United States Senate. So I can't speak to specifically why he hasn't come out stronger against Steve Pearce. I don't know if there's something else going on behind the scenes that I'm not aware of. I can tell you that there hasn't really been any kind of positive communication I've seen between Steve Pearce and Heinrich in the past. I mean, they've been pretty opposed on stuff before. I would encourage Senator Heinrich that if you want to be a voice for hunters, if you want to continue to be a voice for public land in New Mexico, then, we're here trying to protect stuff. I mean, you've got gun groups talking about protecting public land from Senator Mike Lee. He came out very strongly against Senator Lee's bill. We appreciate him doing that. And we're just asking that let's stay consistent with, promoting public ownership of public land and not just kind of handing stuff over to private companies.
Awesome. Zach, we've covered a lot in just over 20 minutes. Is there anything else that we haven't asked you about that you wanted to share about Pearce or your concerns about his nomination?
I think we've touched on a number of the different aspects of kind of why we oppose him. His real mismanagement, this constant purity test of who's the most pro oil and gas people that we can find, really kind of disregarding what a lot of New Mexicans wanted to do. And I think what kind of alarmed me in some of this is the Republican Party has lost elections really badly and then doubled down in the exact same course on why they lost the election so bad. Like there really hasn't been any desire to change course. And that was kind of alarming, is there's really not, like, you're getting a lot of negative feedback from going on outside. Like you keep losing elections, but you're not changing course. And I think that kind of that's part of what alarms me here is, if he is nominated, he is put into position, and you've got people like me saying, let's not just sell off public land where people go shooting and hunting, we're going to be disregarded because you're just in this constant ignoring everything else. You just got these blinders on, you're just ignoring everything else. You're just solely focused on what you want to do. I mean, land management you guys will aware, it's a complex issue. It requires a lot of nuance. It requires a lot of weighting of different interests. I mean, I speak for my interest group, and, we are sometimes opposed with other interest groups. I mean, ultimately we want to preserve and protect public land, make sure that people have the same opportunity, that future generations have the same opportunities that I have had and generations before me have had. But it's a complex issue. It requires a lot of weighting different interests and finding the best solution forward. And I just don't see that at all in somebody like Steve Pearce, where it's this constant, we're just doing things the way I want them to do, just forget any kind of feedback we're getting here, just kind of forget whatever else is going on because we keep losing, but we're just going to keep plowing down this path of we're just doing what I want to do, regardless of whether or not however it else impacts people. And that's a really dangerous kind of mentality to have in something where you have to take in all these different interests, because there's a lot of different interests. And I mean, I mostly have my experience in New Mexico on this, but there's a lot of different interest groups in New Mexico who use land different ways. And do we always agree on it? No, not necessarily. But at the same time, we have to learn to work with, we talk to one another, we work with one another. And oftentimes I work with groups, with hunters groups, with outdoorsman groups, on these different things, because yes, we have our point of view we want to make sure that we get across. So that's kind of another kind of an element that I would put in there, is just that it wasn't just one bad election, everything got better. It's been consistently getting worse, is basically what's going on under his leadership. It wasn't, hey, you had a bad year, you kind of turned stuff around. It's like, no, it's been consistently getting worse, and with really with any change in course or thinking about what they're doing.
Awesome. Well, we'll leave it here. Zach, thank you so much for sharing your opinions and experience with us today. Zach Ford is the president of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Here's a little good news to end this episode. Congress has passed a bill funding the Interior Department that keeps funding for most agencies around the same level as last year. The bill ensures our public lands and parks stay open and funded, which is great, and I don't like how I worded that.
Ignores?
And dismisses calls from President Trump to significantly cut funding for agencies like the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management.
Well, that is it for this episode. You can always reach us at podcast@westernpriorities.org. Go sign up for our daily newsletter, Look West. If you want to stay up to date on all these moving pieces, it is definitely the best way to keep tabs on all of this during the week.
Thanks again to Zach for his time today, and thank you for listening to The Landscape.